Three people stood on the deck of a 66-foot yacht in the middle of the night and watched a man drown, and there was absolutely nothing any of them could do to save him. He was one of their own crew. He was in the water, alive, only meters away. And between them and him was a steel boom the length of a telephone pole, swinging back and forth across the deck completely out of control, because it had just, seconds earlier, killed the man lying at their feet. To go to the rail and reach for the man in the water was to step into the path of the thing that had already taken one life that night. So they watched him fall behind, a shipmate, fully conscious, slipping away into the dark and the waves, while they stood frozen on a boat that was tearing itself apart around them, and they made the most terrible calculation a sailor can make, which is that reaching for him would only add more bodies to the count. His name was Steve Forno, and he was never seen again. This is the story of the yacht Platino, of the two men who died aboard her on a single June night, of the three who survived, and of a piece of equipment failing in the dark that turned a routine ocean passage into a 14-hour fight to stay alive. And by the end of it, you are going to understand exactly how a well-found, multi-million-dollar yacht, crewed by experienced offshore sailors, became a death trap in the space of about 10 seconds, and why, in the end, the one thing that saved the survivors was the very thing this whole channel keeps coming back to. Before I go any further, let me tell you where all of this comes from, because it matters. Two people died on Platino, and everything you are about to hear is built on the official investigation carried out afterward by Maritime New Zealand, on the account given by the three people who survived the night, and on the physical state of the boat when she was recovered. Unlike some of the stories on this channel, this one has survivors, which means we know a great deal about what happened out there, in real detail, from people who were standing on that deck. Where the account is firm, I will tell you. Where investigators had to reconstruct, I will say so. And I am going to treat both of the men who died with the care they are owed. Let me tell you about the boat first, because you cannot understand this accident without understanding what Platino actually was. She was a serious yacht, 20 meters long, which is around 66 feet, and she was a Ron Holland design. If that name means nothing to you, let me put it plainly. Ron Holland is one of the most respected yacht designers in the world, a man whose boats have raced and cruised across every ocean on Earth. This was not a production boat off a forecourt. This was a properly designed, purpose-built ocean-going sailing yacht. She was owned by a New Zealand couple, the McCogues, and they had put an enormous amount into her. By the time she left on this voyage, they had reportedly spent something in the region of 4 million New Zealand dollars on the boat. That is not the number for buying a cheap old boat and doing it up on a budget, the way some of the couples in other stories on this channel did it. This was the other end of the scale entirely. This was people with real resources building exactly the boat they wanted. And here is a detail that matters, because it connects two of the people in this story in a way that makes the ending harder. Platino had suffered fire damage at some earlier point in her life, and she had been refitted, rebuilt, brought back to full health, by a well-known Auckland boat building company called Bryn Wilson Boat Builders. That company was run by a man named Nick Saul. So when Platino set out, Nick Saul was aboard. The man whose company had rebuilt this very boat was sailing on her. He knew that vessel intimately, in the way that only the person who put her back together can know a boat. Hold on to that, because it makes what happened to him particularly cruel. There were 5 people aboard for this passage. The 2 owners, a married couple, one of whom, Tori McKeough, was the skipper, Nick Saul, the boat builder, another crewman named Ross McKee, and Steve Forno, a man in his early 60s. And I want to be very clear about the caliber of the people on that boat, because it destroys the easy assumption that this was a story about amateurs getting in over their heads. Maritime New Zealand's own finding was that Platino was very well equipped, and that every single member of the crew had extensive offshore experience. These were not weekend sailors. These were experienced ocean sailors, on a superbly built and well-found boat, doing something that people like them do routinely. Because that is the other thing to understand. The passage they were on is one of the classic runs of the South Pacific. They were sailing from New Zealand up toward Fiji, a trip of a bit over 1,000 nautical miles, out across the top of the Tasman and into the tropics. The boat had actually been entered in a cruising rally, an organized group passage from Auckland to Fiji, though she withdrew before the start and made the trip independently. But this is a well-traveled route that New Zealand sailors make every winter, escaping the southern cold for the islands. There is one thing about it that every sailor who does it knows, though, and it is important. The water between New Zealand and the tropics is not gentle. That stretch of ocean regularly serves up gales. It is normal, on that passage, to get properly strong winds and big seas at some point. It is not a placid holiday cruise. It is a genuine ocean crossing through a piece of water with a reputation, and everybody who does it knows they are likely to get a hammering somewhere along the way. So set the scene in your mind. An exceptional 66-foot boat, 5 genuinely experienced offshore sailors, a well-known route. Nothing about this picture is reckless, nothing about it is naive. This is as good as it gets, honestly, in terms of preparation and capability. They left and they sailed north, and on the morning of the 13th of June 2016, they were roughly 300 nautical miles north of the top of New Zealand, well offshore, out in the deep water, past the point where any quick help exists. And the weather was doing what that piece of ocean does. The wind was blowing around 40 knots. Let me translate that, because the number gets thrown around and loses its force. 40 knots is a gale. It is the kind of wind that, on land, damages buildings and brings down trees. On the open ocean, it builds the sea into something serious, and on that morning the waves were running at around 3 meters, which is roughly 10 feet, arriving relentlessly, one after another. Now, a boat like Platino can handle that. This is well within what a 66-foot ocean yacht and an experienced crew are built to deal with. It is unpleasant, it is loud, it is hard work, and everyone aboard is tired and bracing against the motion, but it is not, in itself, dangerous for a boat of that quality. Sailors call these conditions a lot of things, but mostly they call them Tuesday. This is what the passage is. They were sailing on what is called a broad reach, which simply means the wind was coming from behind them and off to one side, pushing them along at a good speed. It is a fast, powerful point of sail, and in a strong wind it is exhilarating, the boat surging down the face of the waves. And they were letting the autopilot steer. I need to stop here and explain what an autopilot is, and why they were using it, because this is where the whole thing begins, and if you do not understand this part, none of the rest makes sense. An autopilot is a machine that steers the boat for you. It holds a set course automatically, making tiny constant corrections to the wheel, far more often and more precisely than a human hand could. On a long ocean passage, it is not a luxury. It is essential, because you cannot have a person hand steering for 1,000 miles around the clock. The crew would be destroyed by exhaustion. So the autopilot steers, and the humans navigate, and trim the sails, and rest, and keep watch. Every offshore boat relies on one. Trusting the autopilot to hold the course is completely normal. Correct seamanship. There is nothing whatsoever wrong with what they were doing. But an autopilot is a machine, and machines fail. And in those conditions, on that morning, on that broad reach, in 40 knots of wind and a big following sea, the autopilot on Platino malfunctioned. Here is why that is so dangerous, and I am going to build it carefully in plain English, because this is the mechanical heart of the story. When the wind is behind you, like it was for them, the mainsail, which is the big mainsail attached to the mast, is let right out to one side to catch that following wind. The bottom edge of that mainsail is attached to the boom, which is the heavy horizontal pole, metal, the length of a telephone pole on a boat this size, that runs backward from the mast. And there is a specific, well-known danger to sailing with the wind behind you. If the boat turns the wrong way, even a little, the wind can suddenly get onto the wrong side of that mainsail. When that happens, the sail snaps violently across from one side of the boat to the other, and it drags the boom with it, at enormous speed, right across the width of the deck, at about head height. Sailors call this a crash jibe, or an accidental jibe, and it is one of the most feared events in all of sailing, precisely because that boom becomes a battering ram traveling across a space where the crew are standing. Now put the two things together. The autopilot is the thing holding the boat straight, holding her on a safe course so that the wind stays on the correct side of the sail, and the autopilot failed. When it let go, the boat slewed off her course. She turned, out there in the big sea, in a way nobody had commanded and nobody was ready for. The wind got behind the mainsail, and the boom, all several hundred pounds of it, came scything across the deck. There was a system on board that is supposed to help control the boom, called the main sheet and traveler. In simple terms, it is the arrangement of lines and hardware that holds the boom and lets the crew manage where it sits. And the McCagues had made a modification to that arrangement on Platino, a change to how the main sheet and traveler were set up. I want to be fair about this, because it is easy, from a warm room, to turn a modification into a verdict. Owners modify their boats all the time. It is one of the pleasures and the responsibilities of owning a vessel, tailoring her to how you sail. But the investigation found that when the crash jibe happened, in those conditions, that modified mainsheet and traveler arrangement failed. And that failure is the difference between an accident and a catastrophe. Because a boom that crash jibes but is still under the control of its hardware is a violent event that a crew can usually survive and recover from. A boom whose controlling hardware has broken is something else entirely. It is several hundred pounds of steel, with a full mainsail attached, swinging completely free across a crowded deck, with nothing left aboard to stop it. That is what Platino had, in the dark, in a gale, 300 miles from land. A loose boom, out of anyone's control, sweeping back and forth across the deck with the roll of every wave. Nick Saul was in its path. As the boom came across and the rigging associated with it swung, it struck him. The mainsheet and the traveler hardware, the very gear that had just broken loose, came across like a pendulum and hit him, and the injury was fatal. The man whose company had lovingly rebuilt this boat after a fire, who knew every inch of her, was killed on her deck by a failure of her rigging, in a matter of seconds, before anyone could do a single thing to prevent it. There was no warning, there was no time. One moment the boat was surging along under autopilot in manageable conditions, and the next, a man was down and gone. And it was not over, because it all happened in the same handful of seconds. As the boat made that uncommanded turn, in that same violent motion, a second crewman was thrown from the deck into the sea. This was Steve Forno. Seconds. That is how fast it was. The autopilot failed, the boat turned, the boom came across, one man was struck down, and another was in the water, all inside the space of a breath or two. A calm, ordinary night watch became, in about 10 seconds, a boat with one man dead on deck and one man overboard in a 40-knot gale. And I want you to really understand the position the three survivors were now in, because this is the part of the story that I find almost impossible to sit with, and it is the reason I opened the way I did. Steve Forno was in the water. He had gone over the side into a big, cold, wind-driven sea. And there is a detail here that the investigation noted, and that matters enormously. He was not wearing a survival suit. A survival suit, or an immersion suit, is a full-body insulated suit that dramatically slows down how fast the cold water pulls the heat out of you. In water like that, without one, a person's time is measured in a way that is frighteningly short. The cold begins to disable you almost immediately. Your muscles stop obeying you. Even a strong swimmer, even a calm and experienced sailor, loses the physical ability to help themselves within a shockingly small number of minutes. So Steve Forno was in the sea, in a gale, without the one piece of clothing that buys a person time, and his three shipmates were on the boat, and they could see the situation, and here is the trap that had closed around all of them. To rescue a man in the water, you have to bring the boat back to him and get him aboard. But the boat was not under control. The autopilot was gone. The boom was swinging free, uncontrolled, the same boom that had just killed Nick Saul, sweeping the deck with every roll. The rigging was being torn apart. To go forward, to go to the rail, to work the deck in order to attempt a recovery, meant putting yourself directly into the path of the thing that had already taken one life that night. The three of them, all experienced offshore sailors, were physically unable to bring the boom or the yacht under control, and physically unable to get to Steve Forno. Not because they lacked the courage, because the deck itself had become lethal, and any attempt to cross it to reach him would most likely just have added to the dead. So they had to make the choice that no sailor ever wants to imagine making. They had to accept that they could not save him, that reaching for the man in the water meant dying with him, and they had to let a living, conscious shipmate drift away into the dark behind the boat, and turn their attention to the three lives they might still be able to save, which were their own. Steve Forno was lost. The search that would later go out for him found nothing. He was never recovered. And even now, the boat would not let them be, because the boom was still loose. Understand that the emergency did not end when the two men were gone. The thing that had killed them was still swinging. That free boom, with the mainsail still attached and full of a gale, kept sweeping back and forth, and every swing did more damage to the rigging, the wires and fittings that hold the mast up. The three survivors, in shock, in the dark, in a storm, on a deck they could barely occupy safely, were now trying to keep themselves alive on a boat that was methodically destroying itself. They managed, eventually, to get some control over the yacht itself. But they could never restrain the boom. It was too dangerous to get to, and there was no longer any sound piece of hardware left to secure it with. So it kept swinging, and it kept working at the rig, hour after hour. And later that day, the inevitable happened. The accumulated damage from that endlessly swinging boom finally brought the whole rig down. The mast collapsed. A dismasting is a catastrophic event on any boat. The mast is the tall structure that holds up all the sails, and when it comes down in a tangle of metal spar and steel wire, often over the side, sometimes threatening to hole the hull it is banging against. For a crew already reduced to 3, already carrying the deaths of 2 shipmates, already exhausted and in shock, the loss of the mast turned Platino from a damaged sailing yacht into a powerless hulk, wallowing in a gale, 300 miles from land, with no way to sail anywhere. But here is where this story turns, and where it separates itself from some of the others on this channel. Because the survivors of Platino did the one thing that made all the difference. They had an APARB, that is an emergency position indicating radio beacon, the device I talk about in almost every one of these videos, the one that, the instant you activate it, transmits your identity and your exact position up to search and rescue satellites, and brings help running from over the horizon. And unlike the couples in some of the other stories, whose beacons never transmitted because they were trapped by fire or lost in seconds, the crew of Platino were able to reach theirs, and they activated it. That single action is the reason there are survivors to this story at all. Because the moment that beacon went off, the entire rescue apparatus of the region knew that a vessel was in distress, knew precisely where she was, and started moving. Now, they were a long way out. 300 nautical miles offshore is beyond the easy reach of a rescue helicopter making a round trip. So the response had to be improvised around what was actually available out there in the open ocean, and what was available was other ships. A large container ship called the Southern Lily was directed toward Platino's position. And this is worth pausing on because it is one of the quiet truths of the sea that people do not know. When something goes wrong far offshore, very often your rescuers are not a dramatic military aircraft. They are the crew of a passing merchant ship, ordinary working mariners, who are legally and morally bound to divert and help, and who will turn a vast cargo vessel around and go out of their way to come and get you. But getting people off a small, dismasted, wallowing yacht and onto a huge container ship, in a gale, in a big sea, is genuinely dangerous and genuinely difficult. The two vessels could not simply pull alongside gently. The size difference is enormous. The movement of both boats is violent, and the risk of the yacht being smashed against the ship, or people falling between them, is severe. To bridge the gap, the crew of the Southern Lily had to fire lines across to Platino using pyrotechnics, line-throwing devices that shoot a light rope across the distance so that heavier lines can then be hauled over. Only once that connection was made could they carefully bring the yacht alongside and get the 3 survivors up the side of the ship and aboard, out of the reach of the sea. That rescue happened roughly 14 hours after the accident. Sit with that number for a moment. 14 hours. From the instant the autopilot failed and their world came apart, the 3 survivors had to hold on, keep the boat and themselves in one piece, endure the dismasting, and wait, through a gale, in the dark and into the next day, carrying the deaths of 2 friends, for 14 hours, before hands finally reached down and pulled them to safety. The McCogues and Ross McKee survived. Conditions were too dangerous, at the time of the rescue, to recover Nick Saul's body from the yacht. Platino herself was not lost, incidentally. Some days later, a tug went out and towed the battered, dismasted yacht back to New Zealand, and Nick Saul was brought home. Steve Forno never was. So what did the investigation conclude, and what can we actually take from this? Maritime New Zealand released its full report a little over 2 years later, in July of 2018, and I think it handled a very painful event with real seriousness. It did not reach for blame. It looked at the chain of events and asked how each link could be made stronger for the next crew. The trigger was the autopilot failure. That is what turned a well-sailed boat on a safe course into a boat making a violent, uncommanded turn in dangerous conditions. And the lesson there is not that autopilots are bad, because offshore sailing is impossible without them. The lesson is about what happens when they fail, and how ready the crew is, in that instant, to take control before a jibe develops. The thing that turned that jibe from a violent scare into a double fatality was the failure of the modified main sheet and traveler arrangement. When that hardware let go, The boom became an uncontrolled weapon, and everything after that flowed from it. The death of Nick Saul, the loss of Steve Forno, the destruction of the rig. And the quiet lesson there is a hard one for every owner who loves modifying their boat, which is that when you change a critical system, you are betting the crew's lives on your change being at least as strong as what it replaced, in the very worst conditions the boat will ever see, not the calm ones you tested it in. Off the back of this accident, New Zealand changed its rules for boats leaving on ocean passages. 2 new requirements came in. First, that a proper proportion of the crew must have completed formal sea survival training, so that when the worst happens, more of the people aboard know exactly what to do. And second, that boats must carry a written safety manual, setting out the vessel's own safety procedures, so that critical knowledge does not live in only 1 or 2 heads. That second one echoes something this channel keeps running into. On boat after boat, in story after story, the same weakness appears, which is that the knowledge of how everything works, and what to do when it breaks, is concentrated in too few people. When those people are the ones who go down, everyone else is left guessing. Writing it down, training the whole crew, spreading the knowledge around the boat is not bureaucracy. It is the difference between a crew that can respond and a crew that can only watch. But the deepest lesson of Platino, for me, is not really about hardware at all. It is about the man in the water. Steve Forno went overboard without a survival suit on, and he went over in seconds, with no warning, in the middle of an ordinary night. And that is the thing that should stay with you, if you take nothing else from this. The emergency does not send a warning. It does not wait for you to put your suit on, or clip your tether, or move to the safe part of the deck. Nick Saul and Steve Forno had, between the failure of the autopilot and their deaths, a span of time measured in seconds. There was no window in there to get ready. The only readiness that counts is the readiness you already have on you when it happens. So on a boat, offshore, at night, in any kind of sea, you clip on before you need to, because you will not get the chance after. You wear the thing that keeps you alive in the water before you are in the water, because nobody puts on a survival suit while they are falling. And you understand, before you ever leave the dock, that the sea gives no notice at all. The 3 who lived did everything right in the part of the story they could control. They kept their heads, they kept the boat and themselves together through 14 brutal hours, and above all they got that beacon activated, which is the single reason they came home. If there is a hopeful thread in this, it is that one. The device worked. They reached it, they used it, and it saved 3 lives. But I do not want to end on the equipment. I want to end on the 2 men, because they were not case numbers in a report. Nick Saul was an Auckland boat builder, a man whose own hands and whose own company had rebuilt Platino after a fire and given her a second life. He was, by every account from the community that knew him, a keen sailor, a lifeguard, a rugby player, one of those people who is woven into the sporting and seagoing life of a place. And he died on the deck of the very boat he had restored, doing the thing he loved, killed by the sea in a handful of seconds on an ordinary night. Steve Forno was in his early 60s, an experienced offshore sailor, out on a classic South Pacific passage, with people he trusted. He went into the water alive, and his shipmates could not reach him without dying themselves, and he was never found. There is no grave for Steve Forno. There is a piece of ocean, 300 miles north of New Zealand, and that is all. And there are 3 people who came home, who have to carry both of those losses, and who have to live with the 14 hours and the impossible choice for the rest of their lives. That is its own kind of weight, and I think it is worth acknowledging. Surviving is not the same as being unharmed. So if you are watching this from dry land, and some part of you dreams of blue water and tropical islands and a fast boat carrying you north out of the cold, then let Nick and Steve be the reason you take the boring things seriously, not a reason to stay home. The sea is not evil, it is indifferent, and indifference can be prepared for. Clip on before you need to. Wear the thing that saves you before you are in the water. Spread the knowledge around the whole crew, not just the skipper, and keep the beacon where your hands can reach it, because on Platino, that beacon was the whole difference between 3 funerals and 2. 2 experienced sailors went out to cross an ocean they knew, on a beautiful boat, in a gale that boat could handle, and 10 seconds of machinery failing in the dark took both of them. The others held on through the night and lived. Rest easy, sailors.